Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and we have a great show. It's sort of a sad purpose, but a show that is going to be memorable, and look forward to looking back on this show in years to come. We're here, myself and Noah Potter, who's been on the show before, and we're here to talk about our friend, who's also been a guest on the show numerous times over the years. Is a photograph of Doug Greene from when he was on the show 6 years ago, but he's been on here many times since and before. He was policy director at NORML and the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Law, and he was involved in getting marijuana decriminalized, and he had hoped legalized, but unfortunately a tragic accident took his life just days before it passed. His life's work passed, which is one of those tragedies that happen. So we're here to celebrate Doug's life, not just to moan and be sad about what happened, but to talk about the legacy that he leaves behind, and he does leave a great legacy. He was definitely an advocate of marijuana and an advocate of legalizing marijuana for all the right reasons, and had dedicated his life, as long as I knew him, to it, and I've known him since the 90s. I think the mid-90s or so we met, right? How long did you know Noah, Doug Greene?
I met Doug in 1993 when I joined the Ibogaine legalization movement. That's actually the context in which I met him. I met him at Nine Bleecker.
Mm-hmm. You met him there?
I met Doug at Nine Bleecker at one of the Sunday
Yippee
meetings at the old Yippee House, the publishing, the home of Yipster Times and Overthrow, and later the Yippee Museum and the headquarters of Cures Not Wars, among other things. And I met Doug, I think, in the mix of the very random crew of people that were passing through Nine Bleecker, and he stood out because he was, clean cut, clean shaven, short hair, button down shirt, looking like docksiders, looking very kind of preppy and totally out of place, professional looking, and talking about electoral politics, and totally up on the ins and outs of the elected officials and so on. And I was not in that place at all, and and I was able to relate to him in certain ways. I don't think I really got close to him until I invited him to join the Committee on Drugs and Law of the New York City Bar Association, and that was 2007 or 8 or so. And at that, and then we more opportunities to interact. Always, regular communication. When I had any questions about anything, I would ask him, because if anybody knew, it would be Doug. Yeah. Doug was, I think, unparalleled in his knowledge
of politics, of marijuana law and politics.
Well, I mean, wasn't limited to cannabis, and that was one of the things that was unique about him. I met him as an Ibogaine legalization activist, and he had, he was part of NORML, and NORML's I would say sort of a single issue group. Yeah. It's cannabis, but his scope of knowledge and interest was not at all limited to cannabis. I mean, he had encyclopedic knowledge of all aspects of drug policy. Yeah. He had the broad perspective that most people.
It was amazing to have on this show, because he would just go on and tell us all this stuff that we never heard and never knew about, and he had some deep knowledge, especially of all the machinations going on in Albany.
Yeah.
He knew every state law and what was going on in every state, but he really knew New York City politics, and he had worked in the state legislature, and he knew what was holding it back and how to move it forward, and that's why when his loss hit hard, I mean, the first thing people thought was this done, to eliminate him because of his knowledge, because of his role, his importance, his encyclopedic knowledge, and his work as a political activist. I mean, the first thing that people thought was this a political hit on the eve of the passage of the bill, which failed.
Yeah.
Basically failed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems paranoid.
Yeah.
And it's far-fetched.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it was just kind of, you always have to wonder,
right.
It's just that question mark there. And it's unlikely, but
right.
Who knows? Stranger things have happened.
We never know. There were some witnesses, but they were far away, and we just don't know what happened.
Right. Well, I mean, there's nothing that I've seen. I mean, one of the things. So I was on a bus. I was on a bus heading back to my place in Brooklyn, and I got a call from Dana Beal and asking me if I had any insight into what was going on, because there was a report on Facebook that Doug had passed away, and there was no statement from Doug saying no, I'm still here, and it was just this question mark for like 24 hours easily, people trying to piece together what had happened. There was this daily news story that a man had fallen in the tracks at I guess 79th Street or whatever on the Central Park West, but there was nothing verifying that it was him. So it was just this, and there was no indication as to who knows what was going on, and there's no accounts, and people might calling the precinct, trying to find out. Very, very, very strange and mysterious. But truly a great loss. I mean, he was an unparalleled resource, and he had a great amount of work left to do. And
so psychedelics was one of his other things besides marijuana.
Oh, very much so.
And ibogaine was one of those psychedelic that's used to, and he was involved in drug treatment and helping people get off of heroin and opiates.
Well, I mean, I don't know the extent to which he was actively involved in treatment.
He was a KSAC. He was getting his KSAC training. Like, you know,
okay.
I never knew how far that went, but I know he was definitely very into becoming a KSAC is people who are being hired under Obamacare, which I don't know if was, I don't think it was cut, but probably defunded to a certain degree. That was reaching out, and you know, the whole idea of Obamacare was that we would just flood the nation with drug treatment professionals who were themselves recovered addicts, not always, who were experts at it, and they would be paid a basic living wage, maybe $30,000 a year or something, to reach out and to help people all over the country, and that this would be a way of dealing with heroin addiction.
I got to confess, bless you.
He said a little bit about that. Yeah, he was a
KSAC
and was into it, but you know, that was what we were saying, his wide range of things that Doug was interested in. And I know that ibogaine was one of them, and ibogaine is an hallucinogenic drug from Africa that interrupts addiction and is used to interrupt addiction. You yourself are interested in psychedelics.
Yes, well, that's how I came to meet Doug. I mean, I wasn't motivated by cannabis as an activist. I mean, for me, cannabis was this, I mean, I was aware there were people talking about legalization, but for me, it seemed this somewhat frivolous bourgeois occupation, you know, interest when there were so many real issues, really like hardcore, powerful social issues, and I was always interested in psychedelics I understood, in fact, I mean, one of the issues with ibogaine was I had this strong knowledge, belief verging on knowledge, that there must be something like ibogaine. I didn't know about it, but it's sort of like a matter of logic. Logical operation, there must be something like that, having, you know, experience with psychedelics, and I perceived the political significance of psychedelics. I mean, that's one of the, I think, as I am thinking now, more articulating ideas as the psychedelic movement, legalization movement is really growing in an incomparable way, an unprecedented way, everywhere. I mean, the issue is there's a political dimension to them, and that was why Dana's movement and Cures Not Wars. I mean, Doug and I were there. I mean, we were part of, that's, I guess, one of our commonalities, is that we were there, as you were, at the founding of Cures Not Wars, which that message is still out there for a variety of reasons. That's, you know, we could get into why it's on hiatus.
I mean, now it's transcended a small group. I mean, Cures Not Wars was a victim of its success. Now, ibogaine is in so many countries, and thousands of people are using it, and many of the growing pains are over. There's plenty of it around. There's lots of people who do training in it. It's becoming more and more acceptable. They never really did, although it remains illegal in the United States, there was never a major crackdown on it, and it's still pretty widely used as long as you don't shove the government's face in it.
Well,
you know, which is unfortunate, because you should be able to pursue the cure for something.
Right.
But at the same time, let's talk more about your role while we have you here, because we've talked about this before, your role in helping legalize psychedelics, certain psychedelics in Denver. And I don't know, were you involved also in the movement in Oakland, California?
I did not have the pleasure or privilege
Yeah.
of interacting with people in Oakland. I intend to be out in San Francisco at the end of August, and I hope to meet a variety of the
They
activists out there.
legalize it more broadly. They're all psychedelics pretty much.
Well, okay, so first of all, we got to be really careful to distinguish between decriminalization and legalization. There's a really profound practical distinctions, conceptual and practical distinctions. I am familiar with Denver. I mean, what happened in Denver? I was involved directly in the Denver initiative from May to September. I did a podcast with Lex Pelger that was broadcast on Psychedelic Salon, I think, and Kevin Matthews was an activist, part of the group in Denver that was trying to get the ballot initiative, to get the ordinance language onto the ballot. Heard the podcast, contacted me in May of 2018, right just really days after the cannabis parade here in the city, which allowed me to have some breathing space with the parade over for the year.
Yeah, we'll talk about that again in a minute. We'll go back to that.
And he heard my podcast. He reached out to me, said, "Great, love to talk to you, of course, my new best friend forever." And we spoke, and he explained the situation, and he shared with me some of the documents. And what had happened was that there was a group that had started up in 2017. Another individual whose name escapes me at the moment was acting as the organizer and trying to get a decriminalization ordinance onto the ballot.
In Denver.
In Denver. And they had failed consistently. They'd failed probably once at least, maybe twice. Then there was another submission of the ballot initiative language. That failed, and I started working with Kevin Matthews. Kevin became the executive director of the campaign to try to draft language that the Denver Board of Elections would accept. And
what was different about this one that they accepted?
So, first of all, let me say that I did the initial drafts. I mean, I was in contact with Kevin daily basis, talking about strategy and his order of operations, what he would need to do. Like I said, we can tweak language, we can try to come up with a strategy, but you must find a Colorado licensed criminal defense attorney who can speak to whether this will actually work under Colorado law, et cetera. We were in a variety of conference calls
with
other
attorney as well, so you understood attorney speak, how lawyers think and speak, and which is these activist people kept probably writing language that sounded good to them.
Right. So I mean, there's a lot of
did not pass muster with lawyers.
Well, it was impossible. I mean, what they had done was they had their initial the language they were using purported to basically suspend state law in Denver. And you can't do that. That's not possible. That's a basic premise, a very critical thing that we should address.
Right.
You know, we can't get into it in depth here, but it's critical for New York City, for what will need to be done in New York City for cannabis legalization.
You just can't tell the higher echelon of government to go take a walk. You have to go around them somehow, right?
So So the doctrine is preemption, the preemption doctrine. There's federal preemption of state law, but there's also state preemption of local law, which is a very significant area of litigation where local governments try to control what's going on, and industries like tobacco or energy companies, et cetera, will try to invalidate those laws by bringing a lawsuit for declaration that the local law is preempted.
Well, didn't the state tell the mayor of New York, Governor Cuomo sure told the mayor of New York what to do as far as the L train and the 14th Street. And,
whether that's preemption or not, I'm not sure because I haven't gotten into that much.
That's an interesting thing that came through my mind. So this is so you came up with all the legal jargon that helped them come up with a better way.
Right. I looked to the language of the decriminalization bill for cannabis that I guess was 2005-ish. I mean, I wasn't involved in that, and I felt like there wasn't time or energy.
You're a good lawyer. It's always good to know this guy, Noah Potter, good lawyer, right? He understands the law, especially in these arcane areas like psychedelic law and preemption and things like that, right?
Yeah, and this is the name of the game, and you gotta engage with the system.
So listen. So you played a role because we had every year. I mean, since the early 70s, there's been a marijuana march in New York City. And I remember I wasn't there at the very earliest. I was too young. I wasn't allowed out of the house. But later on, I picked it up. By the late
born,
70s, by the 80s, I picked it up.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sometimes it was a little rough. I mean, especially when Giuliani was mayor in the 90s, there was like a lot of arrests and there was an attempt to really suppress it.
Yeah.
There were different, you could tell in certain era, there was an era when marijuana was much more acceptable. The marches were allowed to happen, and then there would be crackdowns, and then there would be arrests, and fewer people would come, and they would try and change and finagle the route and make it hard for people to know where to go and things like that. And then now we're in a new period where the authorities seemed willing to work with you and Doug Greene, whose picture is behind us, who really took this thing when Dana was not around for whatever reasons, and there was nobody willing to step into his footsteps to deal with the authorities, to get a permit, to get a sound permit, to get a stage. All that stuff's complicated. It's not so easy just to put an event together.
No, it's absolutely not.
You need multiple permits to do every aspect. Marching is one permit. Assembling is another permit. The sound is another permit.
Yeah.
And they each treat each one separately.
Right. I mean, so again, to put it in context, I met Doug in 9 Bleecker, the old Yippie house, and that was one of the things that was, the Cannabis Parade was organized out of 9 Bleecker. And I think it's actually to connect back to Cures Not Wars. The event became the Cures Not Wars event. It was a Cures Not Wars, and Cures Not Wars was the agenda was a comprehensive harm reduction model approach to drug control, but with a psychedelic component, which is very, very unusual. I mean, to my knowledge, there were no grassroots, street level, psychedelic policy reform advocacy groups.
Oh, damn, we were yippies.
I know, but
yippies did acid before we did pot.
Absolutely, and so, but that's one of the key distinctions. I mean, there's a lot of nuances and sociological and political considerations, class, race, all kinds of issues that are wrapped up in this intersection. But that was one of the things that was so unique, and that was one of the things that was so amazing when I found that scene, the 9 Bleecker Yippie Cures Not Wars scene. We met, and where I met Doug, it was such an amazing thing to find kindred spirits and people who understood the political significance. So the event had been a cannabis event, is my understanding, but by the time I came in, Dana Beal had become a major, really at that point, essentially the leading proponent. There was nobody else but him for a long time.
It was hard. In those days, it was hard to do it. It was really nobody who had a straight job and a straight way of making, traditional way of making a living could have got away with it, because you couldn't be if you got involved with that, you couldn't be a teacher. You couldn't get a license on a lot of things. They would, New York is, you go in to get your license for something, and they're going to look at their records and see, oh, you're the guy who does marijuana, and forget it. In those days, it was really a negative,
different
a serious
world.
negative.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's the thing, is that people, I think the current generation of activists. First of all, you have a generation of activists that didn't experience Reagan and Bush Sr. Didn't experience that type of
just say no
Stalinist, Orwellian. Puritanical, I'm looking for the word, autocratic and totalitarian.
You got a good one. That's a good vocabulary.
Okay, I was going to...
Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. George H.W. Bush.
Yeah.
And then his son was a little different, because he was a 12-stepper. He was not to say there's anything wrong with that, but he he wanted to convince everybody to be like him more.
Well, there was a different paradigm in a sense, because you already had tweakings, little tweaches with
recovery.
Well, there are intervening 8 years of Clinton Gore, which not that there was a bit of a thaw, perhaps not full, but.
It wasn't a major thing with him. It wasn't his major calling card, although they did under Clinton start the whole idea of mass incarceration, but they didn't specifically link it to drugs. They linked it more to violence, but drugs got whacked up, because just like with mass incarceration, they would stop you to check you for guns, or
you mean stop and frisk in New York City?
Stop and frisk. They were checking for guns, and they would, or they would, what are you doing here in this neighborhood? And then trying to broken windows policy. You jumped a turnstile, or you're taking a leak against a wall. You broke a small crime. We used to let it go, but not anymore. Now we're going to search you and find your joint. So it all boiled down to a marijuana bust in the end. Because rarely did they ever find a gun on somebody, even though that's purportedly what they were looking for. That was 1 out of 100. The other 99, half of them would have a joint in their pocket. And then next thing you know, you had 50, 60, 70,000 people arrested every year.
Right.
And Doug was an expert at that. He knew all those
sure.
statistics.
Yeah.
He knew all about it. He knew
was
how
amazing.
the whole thing
Yeah.
worked. It was amazing to have him on this show, to have him talk about that kind of stuff.
Well, to kind of pull it back to the parade and the whole the intersection thing. So
We
so
got
Doug
a little loosened up a little bit, and we had more freedoms.
Well, there's a variety of things. So Doug was, of course, Doug was also involved in organizing the parade. I was involved for a few years, and then I took a leave of absence, did some other things, went to law school, and was literally checked out of the activist side of things for a while until about 2004. In 2005, I gave up trying to do different other bar association committees, and I joined the New York City Bar Association's Committee on Drugs and the Law. And that's another story, but I was able to do a lot of plant organizing work in that context. Doug came in, but he was continuously working in Ibogaine, in Cannabis, as Empire State Normal, and work as part of Cures Not Wars.
Everything, any job he did for money was a sideline to his real love.
I mean, his calling, his mission. I mean, there are certain people who, when you see that white light, if you will, you say, this is it. I know what this is my address. Right. I'm not moving from this address. Right. I'm gonna pilot my ship from this. And this is the ship I'm piloting, and for sure. I mean, and I'm the same way, and others are likewise.
So you and him would go. What was it like when you would go and meet with the authorities, with the police, to get the permits and all that kind of stuff?
So to put things in context. So one of the things that happened was that Dana called me in 2010. Dana Beal, hippie, Ibogaine proponent, one of the founders of the cannabis legalization movement, among other things. Called me up in spring of 2010, said, I need some help. The lawyer who's been doing the permit applications for forever said he's not doing it anymore, and said, okay, fine. So I came in 2010 and didn't know how the system worked, didn't know the order of operations. At this point, Troy Smith and Steve Bloom and Ford Focused and I, one of the other organizers, I mean, we know the system like that. I mean, it's an order of operations. We got it. We know the elements. We know what we can do. We know whether it's complicated and we haven't been able to do, et cetera.
Yeah. Where you can march, a direction you can march. There was a lot of debating. Dana always wanted to go up Fifth Avenue because it was traditional.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden they said, no more up Fifth Avenue marches. It's got to be down Fifth Avenue. So and then it becomes an issue of like a sort of a political machismo. If you give up this, what are you going to have to give up next? And so nobody wants to give up anything.
Right. So we're actually not really in that space anymore. And I will say that that first meeting, there's a series of steps you need to go through. It's not the most complicated thing in the world, but you do need to know what you're doing. You need to know the timing. It becomes easier. I mean, I've been doing this since. At this point, I did the permit applications in 2010. I wasn't able to be at the event that year, but of course Dana was still here. Dana was not an involuntary guest of the correctional authorities in Nebraska and Wisconsin, as he was for a few years.
We'll have
another time. But the first meeting was 2010, the police meeting, because you have to meet with the NYPD to go through the elements.
I went with you guys.
You were there.
I represented the neighborhood because I live around there. So.
Right. I think it might have been 2011. I think we had an interesting. There's so many meetings, but that was a debacle. That first one in 2010 was like.
Well, they're mean. They can be mean if you're not ready for it.
It wasn't NYPD, and it was not NYPD. It was our side, but that never happened again. I didn't let that happen. That one happen again. But so. I mean, I went in, suit and tie, attorney, like button down, et cetera, glasses, et cetera.
Respectable. Yeah.
Clean cut. And I mean, at this point, the event has evolved. And I think it's interesting and noteworthy, the dynamics, that the whole dialogue, the whole discourse in the city has changed tremendously. And NYPD, whatever issues that people have with them, other issues, I mean, obviously, college-educated, a professional, I mean, I have my own interactions with them, but NYPD has essentially been fully cooperative for years, and for better, for worse, some people might want the old days.
I like dealing with you because you're sensible, and you are. It's more than just a button-down look. You come there with you're very sensible here. We only have a couple of minutes left, but you're very sensible when you're here. You describe things in a very sensible way. You make a deal, it's a deal. And in the past, dealing with Dana and others, the Yippies and everything, they had so many issues going on.
Yeah, we don't.
It could be very difficult.
Very much so. And the thing is that and I will say, as I say to everybody, that whatever I learned how to do, I learned from Dana. Not that I'm going to say that my entire modus operandi at this point, but watching him and seeing him operate. That's a whole other story in terms of the elements of that, and I can explain. Yes. But it's not necessary to be confrontational, at least at this time. There may have been times where you had no choice, but if it's not necessary to be confrontational, then don't be confrontational. Right. And so the point of engagement was to say, look, we're not here to make trouble. We're here to accomplish a goal, and we're going to work with you. We're professionals. You're professionals. You are you are a highly trained, complicated apparatus, professionals trained in your field. I mean, they know what they're doing in terms of organize. They have their own language, they have their own protocol. It's a profession. Yeah. Whatever else the experiences people might have.
So do we. We have our own language.
That's true. That's true. And there's a culture, and they're cultural. They're cultural issues, and that's, I think, part of it is. And at this point, I'd like to think that we actually have a very positive working relationship. They
loved you guys. They told me that they loved the fact that they had Doug Greene and Al Potter. They used to say Potter and Greene are coming for the marijuana march.
There was one.
Potter and Greene.
I know. There was one. There was one of the meetings.
There they are, right?
There was one of the meetings, and Doug was there for many of those meetings. There came a point where, there came a point where many people have come and gone from the parade organizing, and there came a point where Doug basically stepped back and he was involved. And one of the really key things was that Doug connected us with Richard Gottfried, Assembly Member Richard Gottfried, and we hosted Richard Gottfried, New York State Assembly Member, Upper West Side, the godfather of cannabis policy reform in New York State, who spoke from the stage in Union Square. And that, in a sense, was probably a game changer.
Because you've had all these politicians since. They had Jumaane Williams.
Williams.
He was great. He gave a great speech. I mean, nobody knew about that speech. Jumaane Williams was on our stage for the marijuana march. And nobody had ever seen that before. They used to beat the hell out of us in past years, man, I tell you. Right? This is a big sea change. This is obviously marijuana. And the last 20 seconds, marijuana is now at least decriminalized, and they're seriously decriminalized. Nobody should ever go to jail for it ever again in the state of New York.
Amen.
And that's it. And Doug Greene, the guy whose picture is behind us, is responsible. One of the main people responsible.
And Doug is an inspiration. Doug is a role model and an inspiration.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.